The morning of September 14, 2024, dawned clear in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a Midwestern town where time seems to move at its own pace. Margaret O'Brien, 91, woke up at 5:30 a.m., as she had done for more than 70 years, and spent the first hour of the day getting ready for a special journey. Her arthritic but still dexterous fingers carefully ironed the navy blue dress she saved for important occasions. Over it, she put on the beige cardigan she had knitted herself in the 1940s, when she was a young nurse fresh out of school and the world was at war. The coat, with its perfect stitching and original mother-of-pearl buttons, had survived 8 decades and still fit her perfectly. Margaret looked at herself in the mirror of the bedroom she had shared with no one for 15 years, since she had moved into the small apartment in downtown Cedar Rapids. Her snow-white hair was carefully combed into soft waves, held in place by tortoiseshell hair clips she had worn since the 1950s. Her blue eyes, though surrounded by wrinkles that told the story of 9 decades of life, still sparkled with a liveliness that surprised those who met her for the first time. On the living room table, next to her favorite armchair, was the treasure that would accompany her on that special day. A brown leather-bound photo album, worn by time but lovingly preserved. The yellowed pages held black and white memories of a time when the world was different, when promises were made to last forever, and young love believed in eternity. Margaret picked up the album reverently, as if she were carrying something sacred. "Today would have been our 75th wedding anniversary, William," she murmured to the photograph of a young soldier smiling from a frame on the table. "I'm going to our special place." The walk to Main Street took 40 minutes. Margaret could have called a taxi or asked Mrs. Chen, her neighbor, to drive her, but she wanted to make the journey the same way she did in 1949, when she walked from her parents' house to downtown to meet William before he left for the Korean War. Cedar Rapids had changed dramatically since the 1940s. Family-owned stores had given way to national chains, old movie theaters had become parking lots, and many of the historic buildings had been torn down to make way for modern glass and steel structures. But Margaret knew every block, every corner, every tree planted by previous generations. When she arrived at 412 Main Street, Margaret stopped on the sidewalk and took a deep breath. The red brick building constructed in 1923 was still there, but what operated on the ground floor was completely transformed. Where once stood Thompson's Pharmacy, with its vintage soda fountain and white marble counter, was now the Brew and Bean, a modern cafe with minimalist decor and ambient electronic music. Margaret unconsciously touched the silver cross brooch she wore on her coat, a graduation gift from nursing school. "Well, William," she whispered, "let's see what they've done to our place." Thompson's Pharmacy hadn't just been a pharmacy in the 1940s and 1950s. It was a social gathering place where young couples met at the soda fountain, where World War II veterans gathered to play dominoes, where women like Margaret came for milkshakes after grueling shifts at the local hospital. It was there that Margaret met William O'Brien on a spring afternoon in 1948. She had just finished a 12-hour shift caring for wounded veterans returning from Europe and stopped at the pharmacy for a strawberry milkshake before heading home. William, a 24-year-old mechanic with wavy brown hair and a smile that lit up any room, was at the counter waiting for a prescription for his mother when he saw her come in. "Looks like someone needs a double milkshake," he said, noticing the tiredness in her eyes. "Let me buy you one." Margaret, who at 22 had already seen enough suffering for a lifetime in the hospital corridors, smiled for the first time in weeks. "Only if you keep me company," she replied. They were married 6 months later, on September 14, 1949, in a simple ceremony at the Cedar Rapids Methodist Church. The reception was held at the pharmacy itself, with Mr. Thompson making milkshakes for all the guests. The photographs from that day, carefully preserved in Margaret's album, showed a radiant couple surrounded by friends and family in an atmosphere that exuded happiness and hope. When Margaret entered the Brew and Bean, the first thing she noticed was the silence. There was none of the cheerful chatter she remembered from the pharmacy, none of the familiar sound of the milkshake machine, none of the welcoming noise of people getting to know each other and creating memories. Instead, there was only the low hum of an industrial coffee machine and the soft clicking of laptops from customers working alone at their tables. The space had been completely modernized. Walls that once displayed vintage medicine advertisements and photos of the local community now featured minimalist abstract art. The white marble counter where she and William had met, had been replaced by a polished concrete bar. The wrought iron chairs with red cushions had given way to tall, light-colored wooden stools that prioritized aesthetics over comfort. "Can I help you?" asked a young barista in her 20s, with neon pink hair and multiple tattoos on her arms. Her badge read, "Caitlin Barista." She looked at Margaret with a mixture of curiosity and impatience, clearly wondering what an elderly lady was doing there. "Good morning, dear," Margaret said with a gentle smile. "I'd like to sit down for a while, if possible." Caitlin hesitated. "Sure, but you need to place an order. It's house policy." "Of course," Margaret nodded, scanning the menu for something familiar. "Would you have a plain milkshake? Strawberry?" "No, ma'am. We only serve coffee, specialty teas, smoothies, that sort of thing. It's a specialty coffee shop." Margaret tried to hide her disappointment. "Then, a plain coffee, please. Black." Caitlin prepared the coffee with mechanical efficiency and pointed to a table near the window. Margaret paid the $5, an amount that surprised her, and headed for the table she had chosen. It was exactly where the last seat at the soda fountain had been, where she and William used to sit and watch the street. Carefully, Margaret opened the photo album on the table. The first page showed photos of their engagement, taken at the pharmacy itself in December 1948. She and William were smiling at the counter, he with a chocolate milkshake, she with a strawberry one. Mr. Thompson had insisted on photographing the couple, saying that love stories deserve to be preserved. Margaret turned the pages slowly, reliving each moment. There were photos of the wedding, the honeymoon in Chicago, the small but cozy apartment they set up together. There were pictures of William in his military uniform, posing proudly before leaving for Korea in March 1950. And there was the last photo of them together, taken at the train station on the day of his departure, when he promised he would return to celebrate their first wedding anniversary. But William never returned. He was killed in action in July 1950, 3 weeks before his 26th birthday. Margaret kept the news of his death in a separate folder in the album, along with the American flag that covered his coffin and the letters he sent from Korea. Margaret had been lost in her memories for over an hour when she heard whispering at the next table. 2 cafe employees, Caitlin and a young man named Blake, were whispering as they watched her. "She's been there for over an hour with a coffee she hasn't touched," whispered Blake, a 22-year-old college student who worked part-time at the cafe. "And she keeps leafing through that old album. That's weird." "I think she got lost from some nursing home," Caitlin replied. "It'll be a hassle later. My manager will be mad if she takes up the table all day without ordering anything." Margaret heard every word, but pretended to be focused on the photographs. At 91, she had developed the ability to become almost invisible when necessary, a protection against a world that often treated people her age as inconveniences. "Excuse me, Mum," Blake said, approaching the table with a forced smile. "You'll need to move. This table is for customers who are actively consuming, and there are other people waiting." Margaret looked around. The cafe was practically empty, with only 3 other tables occupied in a space that could seat 20. "I bought a coffee," she said softly, pointing to the untouched cup. "Yes, but that was over an hour ago. You need to place a new order or clear the table." Margaret felt her heart tighten. "Today would have been my 75th wedding anniversary," she said, gently touching a photo from 1949. "I just wanted to spend some time here where it all began. This place was special to us." Blake and Caitlin exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Look, ma'am, I understand that it's sentimental, but we have rules," Blake said. "We can't make exceptions." "Perhaps you could go to the square across the street," Caitlin suggested, with false kindness. "It's a nice place to reminisce." Margaret closed the album slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. "Of course," she said, maintaining her dignity despite the humiliation. "I understand." She stood up slowly, put the album in the black leather bag she had carried since the 1960s, and headed for the door. Neither Blake nor Caitlin helped her or showed any remorse. On her way out, Margaret paused and looked back one last time. "This place used to be full of love," she murmured, more to herself than to the employees. "People met here, fell in love, raised families. It was where the community came together." But her words were lost in the hum of the coffee machine and the indifference of the young people who didn't understand the value of what they were rejecting. Josh Martinez, a 23-year-old journalism student at the University of Iowa, was sitting at a table in the back of the Brew and Bean, working on a story about architectural changes in Cedar Rapids, when he witnessed the entire interaction between Margaret and the employees. Josh had grown up in the city and had always had a special interest in local history, influenced by his Mexican grandparents who told him stories about how different Cedar Rapids was in past decades. Josh was disturbed by what he witnessed. There was something deeply wrong with kicking out an elderly woman who clearly had an emotional connection to that place. When Margaret left, leaving behind only the subtle scent of vintage perfume and a feeling of sadness in the air, Josh decided to take action. "Excuse me," he said to Caitlin. "Do you know who that lady was?" "Just an old woman who was taking up space," Caitlin replied, uninterested. Josh left the cafe and ran after Margaret, but when he reached the sidewalk, she had already disappeared into the crowd on Main Street. It was then that he noticed something on the floor, near the table where she had been sitting, a black and white photograph that had fallen out of the album. The image showed a young couple smiling radiantly in front of what was clearly the same building where the Brew and Bean was located, but decades earlier. The woman in the photo was unmistakably a younger version of Margaret, with the same bright eyes and gentle smile. She was wearing a simple but elegant wedding dress, and standing next to her was a young soldier in military uniform. Behind them, a sign read, "Thompson's Pharmacy Soda Fountain." On the back of the photograph, written in faded but still legible ink, was Margaret and William O'Brien, September 14, 1949, where it all began, with eternal love. Josh stared at the photo for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had happened. This woman was not just a random customer with dementia or a person lost from a nursing home. She had returned to the place where she got married on her 75th wedding anniversary and was kicked out as if she were an inconvenience. Josh Martinez spent the next 3 days investigating Margaret O'Brien's story. As a journalism student, he had access to the digital archives of the Cedar Rapids Gazette and the local historical library. What he discovered was far richer and more touching than he could have imagined. Margaret O'Brien was not just an ordinary Cedar Rapids resident. During World War II, she had served as a volunteer nurse at St. Luke's Hospital, caring for wounded soldiers returning from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. She worked 16-hour shifts for 2 years, often without pay, driven only by her determination to help young men who had sacrificed everything for their country. After marrying William, she continued to work as a nurse while he prepared to be sent to Korea. When William was killed in combat in 1950, Margaret, at age 24, made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would devote her existence to caring for other veterans and their families. For the next 40 years, Margaret worked at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Iowa City, driving 3 hours there and 3 hours back every day because she refused to leave Cedar Rapids, the town where she had been happy with William. She specialized in psychiatric care for veterans with war trauma, becoming one of the first nurses in the Midwest to work specifically with what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Josh found newspaper articles from the 1960s and 1970s that highlighted Margaret's work. She had helped establish the first support program for war widows in the state of Iowa. She organized free support groups in her own home. She paid out of her own pocket for therapy and medication for veterans who couldn't afford it. In 1975, Margaret received the Iowa Humanitarian Award for her volunteer work. In 1985, she was honored by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. In 1995, when she retired at age 70, the hospital created the Margaret O'Brien Wing, dedicated to the treatment of veterans with psychiatric problems. Josh Martinez spent a week trying to find Margaret to return the photograph and learn her story in person. He called every O'Brien listed in the Cedar Rapids phone book, visited senior centers, and asked at hospitals and churches. No one seemed to know where she lived or how to contact her. Finally, a clerk at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Iowa City recognized the description and provided Margaret's address, explaining that she still received mail about her volunteer work. But when Josh arrived at the small apartment in downtown Cedar Rapids on the afternoon of September 19th, 5 days after the incident at the cafe, he was greeted by Mrs. Chen, Margaret's neighbor. "You're late," said Mrs. Chen, a 75-year-old Chinese-American woman with tears in her eyes. "Margaret died last night." Josh felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. What happened?" "Heart attack in her sleep," Mrs. Chen explained. "I found her this morning when she didn't show up for our daily coffee. She was in her living room chair with that photo album on her lap and a letter on the table." Mrs. Chen allowed Josh into the apartment. It was small, but immaculately organized, filled with photographs, books, and military memorabilia. The photo album was open on the coffee table, displaying the page with pictures of Margaret and William's wedding. She had been acting strange since Saturday, Mrs. Chen said. She said she had gone to a special place, but she wasn't welcome there. She was very sad. I think her heart just gave out. On the table was a handwritten letter on plain stationery. Josh recognized the elegant handwriting of Margaret's generation. To whoever finds this letter, my name is Margaret O'Brien. I have lived 91 years, and they have been good years despite the losses. I have dedicated my life to caring for people who have suffered for our country because I believe that everyone deserves compassion and dignity. If I die today, I don't want flowers or elaborate ceremonies. Just remember me with respect as someone who tried to make a difference. The photo album should go to the Cedar Rapids Historical Museum. People need to remember that this place was once full of love and community. Don't hold anger toward those who don't know how to treat the elderly with kindness. They just haven't learned the value of a long life yet. With love for a city that gave me everything, Margaret O'Brien. Josh Martinez knew he had a powerful story on his hands, but he needed to tell it with the respect Margaret deserved. He spent 2 weeks digging deeper into her life, interviewing former co-workers, veterans she had helped, and people who had known her over the decades. What emerged was a portrait of an extraordinary woman who had lived a life of quiet service. Dozens of veterans recounted how Margaret had helped them cope with trauma, depression, and readjustment difficulties. War widows spoke about how she had supported them in their moments of despair. Former co-workers described her tireless dedication and unique ability to bring peace to troubled minds. Josh wrote a 3,000-word article titled "The Nurse Nobody Saw: The Story of Margaret O'Brien," which he first published in the university's student newspaper. He accompanied the text with the photograph he found in the cafe, as well as historical images from the city archives and photos of Margaret's humanitarian work. But Josh didn't stop there. He created a detailed post on Instagram and Facebook, telling Margaret's full story and explaining how she was treated at Brew and Bean in the last days of her life. He included the wedding photograph, images of her work with veterans, and ended with a powerful question. This woman dedicated 70 years of her life to caring for people who suffered for our country. On her 75th wedding anniversary, she was kicked out of the place where she got married because she was taking up space. Margaret O'Brien died 5 days later, alone and heartbroken. How many other Margarets are we ignoring every day? The story began to spread slowly through Cedar Rapids' social media, but gained exponential momentum when it was shared by veterans and their families. Within 48 hours, it had been reposted more than 50,000 times. Within a week, it reached national media outlets. Margaret O'Brien's story touched a raw nerve in American society. At a time of deep political divisions, her story transcended parties and ideologies, uniting people around fundamental values of respect and gratitude. Veterans of foreign wars, VFW, and the American Legion, the two largest veterans organizations in the United States, issued statements condemning the treatment Margaret received. The governor of Iowa declared September 14th Margaret O'Brien Day in honor of the silent caregivers of veterans. But the most pressure fell on Brew and Bean. The company began receiving hundreds of negative reviews online. "You kicked out an American hero. Margaret O'Brien saved more lives than you could ever imagine, and you treated her like trash." This place humiliated a woman who dedicated her entire life to caring for our veterans. Disgusting. 75 years of marriage, and all she wanted was to sit where she met her husband. You have no soul. Protests began to form in front of the cafe. Veterans in uniform and entire families carried signs with photos of Margaret, and phrases such as "Heroes deserve respect" and "Margaret O'Brien, never forgotten." Blake Morrison and Caitlin Stevens, the employees who kicked Margaret out, were quickly identified on social media and began receiving death threats. Both were fired by the cafe's owner, but the damage was already done. The owner of Brew and Bean, Derek Hamilton, a 35-year-old businessman who had bought the space in 2019, desperately tried to control the damage. He posted an apology video on Facebook, promising changes to customer service policy and announcing that he would donate 50% of profits to veterans organizations. "We are deeply ashamed of what happened," Derek said in the video, visibly nervous. Margaret O'Brien was an American hero, and she should have been treated with the respect she deserved. We are implementing new training for employees on how to treat all customers, especially our seniors, with dignity. But the video only made matters worse. The comments were brutal. Too late. You killed that woman's spirit. We don't want your apology. We want you to close down and give this place back to the community. Derek Hamilton only cares now because he's losing money. Where was this concern when Margaret needed it? 3 weeks after Margaret's death, the Brew and Bean was practically empty. Tourists who came specifically to see the place where Margaret was humiliated took pictures of the facade but refused to go inside. Revenue fell 80% in a month. Derek Hamilton tried several strategies to save the business. He changed the name to Thompson's Soda Fountain in honor of the original pharmacy. He hired a local historian to create an exhibit about the history of the building. He offered free milkshakes to veterans. Nothing worked. In November 2024, Derek was forced to close the cafe and sell the building for a fraction of what he had paid for it. The space stood empty for 2 months with makeshift posters plastered on the windows. Margaret O'Brien, American heroine, lest we forget, respect has no age. Josh Martinez, the journalist who discovered the story, organized a fundraising campaign to create a proper memorial for Margaret. The response was overwhelming. In 2 weeks, more than 15,000 people had donated nearly $200,000. With the money, Josh and a committee of veterans purchased the building that had housed Thompson's Pharmacy and converted the ground floor into the Margaret O'Brien Memorial Center, a museum dedicated to the history of Iowa veterans and a support center for military families. The center faithfully recreated a section of the old soda fountain, complete with the original marble counter that was found in a city warehouse. Photographs of Margaret and William were enlarged and displayed on the walls, along with stories of dozens of veterans she had helped over the years. But the centerpiece of the memorial was simple: a red wrought iron bench positioned exactly where Margaret had sat in her last happy moments. A bronze plaque on the bench read, "In memory of Margaret O'Brien, 1933-2024, nurse, humanitarian, silent heroine, she was never invisible, just forgotten by those who didn't know to look where it all began. September 14th, 1949. Margaret and William O'Brien, love that transcends time." Margaret O'Brien's story has become a case study in nursing schools, customer service training programs, and gerontology courses across the country. Her life inspired the creation of the Margaret O'Brien Law in Iowa, which establishes specific protocols for the respectful treatment of seniors in commercial establishments. Blake Morrison, the young man who kicked Margaret out, moved to another state and was never able to overcome the guilt of what he had done. He volunteered at nursing homes for 2 years before he was able to sleep peacefully again. Caitlin Stevens underwent therapy for 6 months to deal with the depression she developed after the incident. She changed careers, becoming a social worker specializing in the rights of the elderly. Derek Hamilton lost everything financially, but said in later interviews that the experience transformed him as a person. "Margaret taught me that business is about people, not profit," he said. "I learned it too late, but I learned it." 5 years after her death, Margaret O'Brien became a national symbol of quiet service and dignity. The Margaret O'Brien Memorial Center welcomes more than 50,000 visitors a year, including delegations from other countries interested in learning about veteran care. Josh Martinez, now an established journalist, maintains a website where people can share stories of seniors who have been disrespected or forgotten. "Margaret's story taught me that real journalism isn't just about reporting facts," he says. "It's about giving a voice to those who don't have one." The center offers free milkshakes on Saturdays, made with the original recipe from Thompson's Pharmacy. Each drink comes with a small card that tells a different story about Margaret or other veterans she helped. Mrs. Chen, Margaret's neighbor, now 80, volunteers at the center 3 times a week. "Margaret always said that the best stories are about ordinary people doing extraordinary things," she tells visitors. "She never thought she was special, but she changed hundreds of lives." On the last Thursday of every month, veterans from across the Midwest gather at the Margaret O'Brien Memorial Center for a Circle of Stories, an event where they share memories and support one another. The gathering always ends with a silent toast, strawberry milkshakes raised in honor of Margaret, and all the silent caregivers who dedicate their lives to helping others. The wedding photograph Josh found on the cafe floor is framed at the center's main entrance. Visitors often stop to read the inscription on the back, "Where it all began, with everlasting love." And perhaps that is the most profound lesson of Margaret O'Brien's story. True love never ends. It echoes through decades, inspires generations, and continues to make a difference long after the people who created it are gone. Margaret just wanted to be remembered with respect. Instead, she became immortal, not as a saint or mythological heroine, but as a reminder that every life has value, every person has a story worth hearing, and that the true measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. Brew and Bean became a footnote in history. Margaret O'Brien became the story. And every morning, when the sun streams through the windows of the Memorial Centre and illuminates the red bench where she should have been honoured, visitors whisper the words,